Okay, sorry about that. I got a phone call and we got cut off. I was in the midst of introducing Tom Regan's idea. And I said that Regan regards animals as beings who are experiencing subjects of a life, and he thinks that animals have rights. Now, to have a right means that you have a claim to something. So, to say that I have a right to my property means that I have a claim to it. This is my property, I own it, so you can't just come in my house, you can't take my car. And so, rights generally are grounded in, at least political rights are generally grounded in something like a constitution. So it is the Constitution that guarantees the right to property, and therefore that provides the basis for a claim to property for individual citizens, and therefore you have a right to property because the Constitution guarantees you this claim to keep and possess and not have what you own interfered. So the kind of rights that Regan is talking about are not so much political rights grounded in the Constitution, but moral rights grounded in a philosophical framework. And that framework is this rights-based deontological framework. So, what do animals have a claim to? Well, they have a claim to having interests. And this is pretty similar to what I was explaining about Peter Singer when he said that animals can be harmed or benefited. So Regan agrees with that animals, to have an interest means that you can be either harmed or benefited. Whereas Singer locates this harm in a physical pain, sentience, Regan basically does something similar but grounds it in this idea that animals are experiencing subjects of a life. Given that they are subjects of a life, they have a claim to their own lives. Therefore, they have a right to their own lives. And again, the rights that Regan sees animals as having are mainly negative rights of non-interference. So it's not a right to own property, it's not a right to vote, a right to drive, a right to the best dog food or animal feed, but really it's a negative right to not be killed, to not be tortured, to not be abused, to not be exploited or any of these things. So, on that basis, animals have a claim to their own lives, and they have a right to not be killed and tortured, and so on and so forth. So, for Regan, he too thinks that people should stop consuming animals, that there should be an end to the experimentation of on animals and sport hunting and this kind of thing. So he leaves open he doesn't think it's immoral for people to go out and hunt animals for food. He's not going to do that. He's not going to give you, if you're a hunter, a ride to the forest to go do that. But he at least thinks it's more respectable than hunting for sport or other things like horse races, bullfighting, dog fighting, etc., etc. So, in both cases, Singer and Regan, we basically have moral frameworks that ground the moral consideration of individual animals, more or less based in the idea that they can be either harmed or benefited. So, because Regan grounds his animal ethic in individuals, this means that species, questions of species going extinct or harm to species, that the species themselves are not directly considered. So, how would someone like like Regan, be able to cover the moral consideration of species? So if we say species, there was a time when, the bald eagle or certain kinds of whales were on the endangered species list. And so Regan says there is no special moral obligation to species per se. There are only moral obligations to individual animals. But because species are comprised of individual animals, that means that we can talk about moral consideration regarding species rather than direct to species. So this distinction between is between direct duties and indirect duties. So going back to individual animals for a second, an older way to like talk about treating animals well, but stopping short of arguing that they have direct or moral rights or should get direct consideration, is to say that human beings had moral obligations regarding animals. So, and this is like, you know, the older way of thinking about it. So you say, I don't actually owe to a particular dog an obligation not to kick it. My obligation not to kick the dog is directly related to the dog's owner, because the dog is property of the dog owner. So, excuse me, so I have an indirect duty to the dog not to kick it in virtue of a direct duty to the dog owner not to harm the dog, the owner's property. So notice that the value that I'm ascribing to animals on this older model is a sort of instrumental value rather than an intrinsic value. And this distinction between intrinsic and instrumental value is a big distinction in animal rights, so, or moral consideration of animals. So, the instrumental way of thinking about it is animals have a good, they have a value, but it's only a good for something. So they are resources. They're resources for food, or you use you use cows on a farm not just to kill them for their meat, but you use them to graze grass if they are, you know, free range. You can get a bull to pull certain things. You ride horses. You can use animals in a variety of ways. And people think it's okay to do that because they are instruments for human use. Environmentalists and animal rights activists say it's not just instrumental value that animals have. They also have an intrinsic value or an inherent worth. So Reagan says, because of the fact that non-human animals are experiencing subjects of a life, they have an inherent value, an intrinsic worth. They are worth something and have a value apart from whatever uses human beings might utilize them for. So, this idea that we only have obligations to obligations regarding animals speaks to this sort of instrumentalist way of looking at them, rather than arguing that we have direct duties to animals in virtue of either Singer's sentience or Reagan's animal rights. So to review this part, we've talked about two models, a consequentialist and a rights-based framework that would extend moral consideration to non-human animals and treat them as if they had an inherent worth and intrinsic value, not just instrumental use. Reagan, of course, as I said, thinks that animals are experiencing subjects of a life. Singer says that they are sentient. Those two ideas are not something that can apply to floral life, plants, trees, so on and so forth. So now let's move to talking about plants and forests and so forth. There's a philosopher named Christopher Stone who has an article, "Should Trees Have Moral Standing?" And this is the idea that, you know, is it possible to extend moral consideration to floral life, to plants? So one thing to get this going is he too, Christopher Stone, acknowledges that the history of morality is a history of giving some people consideration and not others. But over time, the circle of consideration, who is considered, is expanding. And before we even get to animals or plants, the ways in which that consideration has been expanded would be to, cover people of color and women who had not previously been considered, but then also children. I mean, if you look at children and workers. So the idea that it is illegal to put children into factories or wherever and make them work came from a workers' rights movement. The idea that there is a minimum wage or a cap to how many hours, typically 40, that are worked in each week. Protesters in the early 20th century, workers' rights protesters, had to argue and protest in order for all of us to gain those rights, to gain, minimum wage and so on and so forth. And then we can also think about how, some people argue that groups of people have particular rights. So the rights of unions or the rights of corporations. You don't have to agree with that. I mean, people typically have critical things to say about treating corporations as persons, unless it's maybe a corporation that they like, and then it's okay, or if it's another group that they like. There's a lot of philosophical work about how collectives and communities can have rights, and regardless of what you think about, I'm sure you acknowledge that it's possible. Then we can also talk about back to these two examples of infants on the one hand, or older people who have become debilitated, or people in comas. If you have someone who's in a coma and they own property, and that property needs to be maintained, typically what happens is there's someone who has power of attorney, who acts as a representative to make decisions on the comatose person's behalf, or on the infant's behalf, or on the elderly person's behalf. So we call these people representatives, and that's exactly what they do. They represent the interests and the will of the people who can't represent themselves. So if we already have this idea that non-individuals, like a union or a corporation, could be treated as a person with rights, and we have this idea that we have other kinds of beings who could have representatives, why couldn't we apply those two ideas to plants, to forests? And, if you think about, there already are existing protections, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the fact that we have national parks, the fact that we have an EPA. I'll also, point out that for the majority of the 20th century, all this environmental stuff and climate change and parks, it was not partisan. It was something that most people stood behind. I mean, the EPA was actually started by Republican President Nixon, and so all these climate issues and environmental issues have not previously been so divisive and partisan. We'll save it for another day as to why they are like that, or you can look into it on your own. So the point then is there's already various existing precedents for thinking that different kinds of beings, especially beings that can't represent themselves, might have representatives that would represent their interests. Okay, so why should we think a tree or a plant has a kind of intrinsic worth and is deserving of moral consideration or ought to be represented? I mean, even if everybody were vegan, you'd still have to grow plants, lettuce and carrots and kale and potatoes and bok choy and chard, all the things I've been eating at Urban Roots, from Urban Roots. Those things, are alive. Why shouldn't we eat them? Well, another guy named Paul Taylor, in his article, Ethics and Respect for Nature, argues that even flowers or floral life, his big phrase is, they are teleological centers of life. Now, we remember this word telos, which means goal or purpose or end. Center of a life simply means that plants, trees are alive. They are teleological insofar as they are trying to achieve their purpose. So this tree above me, what is its purpose? It's not really that complicated. Its purpose is to be a tree, to grow and to flourish, to branch out and to become fecund, which is, just rich, and to reproduce itself. So all these branches, you could take a branch off and plant it in the ground. That would be called a scion, S-C-I-O-N. And then if it took root, it could grow. But so the point is that a tree's purpose is to be a tree, to grow, to flourish, to produce, fruit or flowers or whatever, and then to reproduce itself. So again, when we're talking about like what we might owe to animals and plants, we're not making these false equivalencies about they should have the same rights as human beings or this or that, but mainly we're like aiming toward a different kind of respect for nature, for respect for things that might have a kind of intrinsic value, that have an end of their own, that are apart from the ends of human beings, the purposes and the goals of human beings. So, on that line of thinking, Paul Taylor argues that he doesn't argue that we should never cut down a tree, that we should never pick a carrot and eat it, but he says that we need to have a different kind of respect for nature that historically in the 20th century, post the industrial era and up to today, we really haven't had this kind of respect for nature. This means treating nature as if it does have an intrinsic value and inherent worth. And again, that does not mean that we can't make use of animals, but of plants. But we need to consider what their good is. So just to give you some more distinctions, I've talked about an instrumental good. You use a cow to get a hamburger, you use a horse to get from A to B, you use a carrot to eat, you use a tree for shade, this kind of thing. So we get various uses. Those are what we might call anthropocentric uses. Anthro means man, centric, center, so human-centered uses. There are also instrumental ecological purposes of trees. So as you, I'm sure, know, trees produce oxygen, and that is partly their ecological role. Also, they provide homes for animals. Squirrels and birds and so forth live in the trees, and then you can rip open some bark maybe, especially in like a dead tree, and you see a bunch of insects and worms and so on and so forth. And the tree that grows in the ground with a root system, absorbing water and circulated in the root system, has a role to play in the sort of nourishment and the nutrient cycle of the various nutrients in the ground. So talking about phosphorus, nitrogen, so on and so forth. So there is an intrinsic value, Paul Taylor would say, to trees and floral life. There is a human-centered instrumental value, but then there's also an ecological value. And we need to have a certain kind of respect for nature that appreciates these different kinds of values, rather than looking at nature as if it's just this like well of resources that human beings can come into and plunder, can deforest certain areas, can deplete certain kinds of beings, run different kinds of animals into extinction, pollute, put toxic waste in lakes and damage aquatic life, and this kind of thing. Okay, so one of the last things I want to talk about is other more ecologically minded considerations for our use of animals. So, we've talked about, I forgot to lay out this distinction between animal ethics and environmental ethics. So animal ethics is within environmental ethics, but it's mainly focused on individual animals. So Singer and Reagan, they're doing animal ethics. Christopher Stone is not merely doing animal ethics if he's talking about extending moral consideration to plants. And when Paul Taylor talks about ethics and respect for nature, he's not merely talking about animals, but nature of course includes animals, but it also includes plants, the soil, mountains, a lake, ecosystems. And this is a different kind of thing, this is an environmental ethic. So an ecosystem, kind of like what I was saying about species, can't experience pain. It's only the individuals within it that can experience pain, and not necessarily individual plants that can experience pain. So, the environmental ethic, is ecological. The key idea about ecology that you need to understand is simply this. The basic idea in ecology is that everything is a big system. Nature is a system. Being a system means that there are lots of different parts, and these parts are interrelated. Often they are interdependent on one another. So this idea of what I was saying about the tree's role in replenishing the nutrients in the soil, that's an example of ecological interdependency, right? So the environmental ethicists are interested in the big picture. So let me give you an example of someone who is more on this ecological framework. This is a guy, maybe you've heard of him. He was an early 20th century ecologist, and his name was Aldo Leopold. So this is a guy who, you know, wouldn't really think too much of individual animal rights. This is a guy who hunted, but he also was a person who showed respect for animals. So for someone like Leopold, what's most important is the big picture. So he would say that more important than an individual animal is the preservation of its species. And in his famous essay called The Land Ethic, he says that humans have an obligation to respect the stability, integrity, and beauty of the biotic community. Biotic community is just another term for ecosystem or, ecological system. It's a community because it's comprised of individual members, animals and plants, their interrelated parts, the systems that govern them, so on and so forth. So, as I said, he was an avid hunter, and he saw the human relationship with nature in terms of stewardship. So he thought that human beings should take care of the world, should take care of nature, of animals, of forests. And taking care of them doesn't mean we can't use them, but it means we have to protect the stability, integrity, and beauty of nature. So the stability would be, the fact that an ecosystem is sustainable, that it can sustain itself. But when we pollute certain areas, when we damage them, when we take certain things out of particular areas, we can affect their ability to sustain themselves. So I just want to make a point about how there is a connection between the individual animals we use and an ecosystem's ability to sustain itself. So a lot of people, for example, are pescatarians. This means that they don't eat meat, but they eat fish. And a lot of people think, well, fish don't have the same kind of circulatory systems as a cow or other kinds of mammals, therefore they don't experience pain. I mean, some of that is just straight up false. But it creates this idea that there is less harm in killing something like fish than there is in killing mammals. And on Singer's analysis, that would kind of be speciesist, because we're saying that the animals that are closest to us deserve the consideration. But fishing is actually quite environmentally damaging. Various kinds of fish have been fished into extinction. And then there are these other techniques of fishing like dredging, or nets. So fishing by nets, I'm sure you've seen videos of turtles and other kinds of animals not intended to be caught in these nets. Then there's, I believe it's called dredging, where there's kind of like a big claw scraped on the bottom of the ocean floor to catch certain kinds of fish. But what it disrupts is the ecosystem stability by, first of all, taking certain fish out of an area that eat algae or eat other fish, such that when you take them out, then maybe this population of fish expands, or this population of fish decreases, or there's no algae for certain kinds of fish to eat, and so its ability to sustain is negatively affected. So when you talk about should I eat fish, the point is it's not merely about the fish anymore. It's about the bigger idea. And if you're interested in this idea, I would recommend a documentary on Netflix called Cowspiracy. And that whole film is about how no one talks about the relationship between animal agriculture and climate change. The big takeaway, and this film was based on a 2006 UN study, and there have been other studies that have come out since then that have bolstered this idea, that animal agriculture is actually the leading cause of climate change. Even though most people talk about energy efficient light bulbs, driving a Prius, and other kinds of fossil fuels are a part of it. But probably the biggest impact you could have right now to combat climate change is to stop eating meat and dairy. Why is that? Well, when you have a robust animal like a cow eats many tens of pounds of grain and feed a day. Where does that grain come from? It has to be grown. What do you need to grow grain? You need land. Is land readily available? Not necessarily. In parts of Brazil, the Amazon has been deforested in order to make room for land to grow grain to feed cows. They don't just eat a lot of grain. Your average cow drinks 30 to 50 gallons of water a day. Not to mention all the water you need to grow that grain. So you need land, you need water, then you gotta give it to the cows, they eat a lot of it. And so it's something like 30 to 60 gallons of water that go into producing, 1 ounce of meat. Not to mention all the fossil fuels used in deforestation, in transportation, and so on and so forth. There's also an issue, you probably have heard about this because it's funny, I guess, but there's a lot of methane that comes from cows, particularly in their flatulence. And so methane is actually a much harsher thing to put out in the air than carbon, but there's less methane emitted than carbon, so we end up talking about carbon more. So again, people like to frame the issue of eating animals as if it's merely about animals. But now the calculus is really about the impact in terms of the climate from eating animals. So, the integrity, back to Leopold, stability, integrity, and beauty, the integrity aspect is that, an ecological area is a whole. To take certain parts out of it is to make it less than whole. It's to take away its integrity. So when we could talk about fracking, for example, or looking for oil 2 miles out and then a mile or 2 down into the ocean. How that is disruptive of the integrity, especially when there's like an oil spill, or when certain mountaintops are destroyed, or when forests are cut down. So that's what integrity is. And then we have beauty, which is interesting. This is an aesthetic consideration that Leopold argues is part of the ethic, that nature has a beauty, and we should respect the beauty of nature. And this means don't do things that pollute it, that don't do things that damage the aesthetic, that affect its beauty. All right, so that was a lot to get through, and so let me review. What we talked about was animal ethics. We talked about Singer's utilitarian framework based in sentience. We talked about Reagan's rights-based framework based in animals having interests. We talked about the possibility of the moral consideration of species of animals. Then we talked about Christopher Stone and how it could be possible to extend moral consideration to individual plants and then also species of plants and forests. We talked about Paul Taylor and his general ethic and respect for nature, and the key idea there was that plants and animals are teleological centers of life. And then we talked, this would fall under the environmental ethic. Then Stone and Taylor, and then Leopold as a representative of the ecological ethic. And as I said before, just to end with that, Leopold thinks that we ought to be stewards of the natural world, that we need to take care of the natural world and act on its behalf and protect the stability, integrity, and beauty of the biotic community. All right, so that will do it for animal ethics and environmental ethics. We'll see y'all next time.